At its peak, a single war reached into nearly every corner of the living world. It burned in the snows of Russia and the deserts of North Africa, in the jungles of the Pacific and the streets of half the cities of Europe. It pulled in soldiers who had never heard of the places where they would die, and it ended the lives of more human beings than any other event in all of history. When it began, the men who started it believed it would be short, sharp, and glorious. By the time it ended, 6 long years later, the map of the world had been redrawn. 2 great cities had vanished in a single flash of light, and an old order that had stood for centuries lay in ruins. Whole nations had been swept away and remade. Tens of millions were dead, and the survivors looked out over a changed and frightened world, trying to understand how the entire earth had been set on fire. This is the story of how it happened, not in the language of textbooks, but as a long, slow journey through the years, from the uneasy quiet that followed one terrible war to the storm that grew out of its ashes, and on through the longest, darkest, and most consequential conflict the world has ever known. It is a story of ambition and fear, of ordinary people caught in events far larger than themselves, of courage and cowardice, of cruelty almost beyond belief, and of an ending that left the whole world holding its breath. So lower the lights and let the years settle around you. Wherever you are, whatever hour it is in your part of the world, let the long road of this story carry you gently into rest. We begin not with the war itself, but in the quiet, wounded years before it, when the world believed, for a little while, that the worst was already behind it. In the autumn of 1918, the guns of the First World War fell silent at last. For 4 years they had thundered across the fields of Europe. And now, on a cold November morning, they simply stopped. In the trenches that ran like a wound across France and Belgium, exhausted men climbed out into a strange and ringing quiet. Some wept. Some could not believe it was real. Behind them lay a generation of the dead, nearly 10 million soldiers gone, and millions more crippled, blinded, or broken in mind. The war that the world had called the war to end all wars was over, and almost no one understood that it had not ended anything at all. It had only paused. The peace that followed was made in the gilded halls of a palace outside Paris, at a place called Versailles. There the victorious nations gathered to decide the fate of the defeated, and above all the fate of Germany. The leaders who sat at those tables were tired and angry men carrying the grief of their own ruined countries. France had suffered most of all. Its richest provinces turned to mud and craters, and the French wanted Germany made so weak that it could never rise again. They wanted Germany to pay, in land, in gold, in pride. And so the treaty they wrote was a harsh one. Germany lost great pieces of its territory. Its army was cut down to a shadow. Its colonies were stripped away, and it was forced to accept the blame for the entire war and to pay enormous sums in reparations, debts so vast that they could never truly be repaid. To the men who signed it, the treaty felt like justice. To the German people, it felt like a knife in the back. They had not believed they were losing the war until suddenly it was lost. Their armies had never been driven out of foreign soil, never seen the enemy march into Berlin. And yet here they were, blamed for everything, humiliated before the world, their economy crippled before it had even begun to heal, in the beer halls and the bread lines of a defeated nation. A poisonous idea began to take root. It whispered that Germany had not been beaten on the battlefield at all, but betrayed from within by traitors and weaklings and enemies hidden among them. It was a lie, but it was a comforting lie for a wounded people, and in the years to come, a man would rise who knew exactly how to use it. The wider world, meanwhile, wanted only to forget. The nations that had won the war turned inward, sick of blood and sacrifice, longing for the ordinary pleasures of peace. In America, which had entered the war late and emerged stronger than ever, the 1920s roared with music and money and a giddy sense that the future would only grow brighter. In Britain and France, people tried to rebuild their lives and bury their dead, and pretend that the nightmare was finished. A new organisation, the League of Nations, was founded to keep the peace forever, to settle the quarrels of nations with words instead of weapons. It was a beautiful idea, but it had no army, no real power, and the most powerful nation in the world, America, refused to join it at all. The peace that everyone longed for was built on weak foundations, over ground that still trembled, and beneath the music and the celebration, the old hatreds were not dead. They were only sleeping and waiting like the war itself, for the moment to wake. The man who would set the world aflame was, in those early years, a nobody. He had been born in a small town on the border of Austria, the son of a stern customs official, and he had grown into a sullen, dreamy youth, with a talent for drawing and a burning sense that the world had cheated him of his due. He wanted to be an artist, and twice the great art academy of Vienna turned him away. For years, he drifted through that glittering imperial city, sleeping in shelters for homeless men, selling little painted postcards to scrape together a few coins, nursing his resentments and his strange and growing hatreds. When the First World War came, he found in it a purpose he had never known. He served as a messenger on the Western Front, was wounded, was decorated for bravery, and was lying in a hospital bed, temporarily blinded by gas, when he learned that Germany had surrendered. The news broke something inside him. He decided, lying there in the dark, that he had been called to save his adopted nation from the traitors who had betrayed it. His name was Adolf Hitler. In the chaos of post-war Germany, such men were everywhere, angry veterans and bitter dreamers gathering in the back rooms of taverns to curse the new government and plot its overthrow. Hitler found his way into one of these tiny fringe groups, a handful of malcontents calling themselves a workers' party. But he had discovered, almost by accident, the one gift that would carry him to the heights of power. He could speak. When he stood before a crowd, something changed in him. His awkwardness fell away, his voice rose and cracked and hammered, and he poured out the rage and the longing that the broken people of Germany felt, but could not name. He gave them enemies to blame, and a glorious destiny to dream of. He told them they were not failures, but victims, not a defeated people, but a master race held down by lesser men. And slowly, in the smoke and the shouting of those beer halls, people began to listen. Germany was not the only nation where strong and dangerous men were rising. In Italy, a former school teacher and newspaper editor named Benito Mussolini had already seized power, marching on the capital with his black-shirted followers, and proclaiming a new kind of state, one in which the individual existed only to serve the nation, where opposition was crushed and the leader was obeyed without question. He called this idea fascism, and he promised to restore the glory of ancient Rome. Across the world, in Japan, a different but equally dangerous spirit was stirring. There, a proud and ambitious military caste was coming to dominate the government, dreaming of an empire that would make Japan the master of all Asia, and growing impatient with the cautious civilian leaders who held them back. In each of these nations, the same dark current was flowing. It was a hunger for greatness, a contempt for weakness, and a willingness to do terrible things to get what they wanted. For a time, it seemed that Germany might escape this fate. After the worst of the early chaos, the 1920s brought a fragile recovery. The economy steadied, the reparations were eased, Foreign money flowed in, and for a few bright years Berlin became one of the most vibrant and creative cities in the world. A place of art and music and wild experiment. Hitler, who had tried and failed to seize power by force, and had spent a short time in prison for it, seemed like a fading figure from an uglier past. His ranting about traitors and master races sounded, to most respectable Germans, like the noise of a crank. But that fragile recovery rested on a single, fatal weakness. It was built on borrowed money, much of it from America. And in the autumn of 1929, on the far side of the Atlantic, the great stock market of New York collapsed. The crash spread across the world like a sickness. Banks failed. Loans were called in. Factories closed their gates and threw their workers into the street. The boom of the 20s gave way to the cruelest economic depression the modern world had ever seen. And nowhere did it strike harder than in Germany, whose entire recovery had been propped up by foreign loans that now vanished overnight. Within a few years, 1 German worker in 3 had no job at all. Families lost their homes and their savings. Men who had fought for their country stood in long grey lines waiting for a bowl of soup, their dignity stripped away, their faith in the future gone. And in that desperate misery, the people who had once dismissed Hitler as a crank began, at last, to listen to him. He was the only one who seemed to offer not just relief but pride, not just bread but a reason to hope. He promised work and order and the return of German greatness. And to a nation in despair, it was enough. In the early 1930s, with the Depression at its worst, Hitler and his party rose with frightening speed. In election after election, their share of the vote climbed until they were the largest party in the German parliament. Still, they did not hold a true majority, and the old conservative politicians who controlled the government looked on Hitler with distaste. They thought him vulgar, a low-born rabble-rouser. But they also thought him useful, a tool they could use to win the loyalty of the angry masses and then discard. They believed they could control him. In January of 1933, in a fateful misjudgment that would cost the world dearly, they handed him the office of Chancellor, the head of the German government, certain that they could keep him in check. It was one of the gravest mistakes in the history of the world. They had not understood the man they were dealing with. Within months, he had swept them all aside. Hitler moved to seize total power with ruthless speed. When a fire gutted the parliament building, he used the panic to suspend the basic freedoms of the German people. His opponents were arrested, beaten, or simply killed. Rival parties were banned, the free press was silenced, labour unions were crushed. Step by step, the machinery of a free society was dismantled, and in its place rose a single, total state, answerable to one man alone. He called himself the Führer, the leader, and he demanded absolute obedience. School children were taught to worship him. The radio and the cinema poured out his message day and night, and at the dark heart of his vision was a hatred so deep and so deliberate that the world had never seen its like, a hatred for the Jewish people, whom he blamed for every misfortune that had ever befallen Germany. From his earliest days in power, that hatred was written into law. Jews were stripped of their rights, their citizenship, their livelihoods, marked out and isolated in a slow and methodical persecution that would, in the years to come, descend into something far worse than anyone could yet imagine. To the watching world, however, Germany under Hitler looked at first like a success. The unemployed were put back to work, building roads and weapons. The economy roared back to life. The streets were orderly. The people seemed proud and purposeful again. And many foreign visitors came away impressed, even admiring. They did not see, or did not wish to see, the prisons filling with dissenters, the secret police, the growing terror beneath the shining surface. And they did not understand, until it was far too late, what Hitler truly intended. For he had never hidden his goals. He meant to tear up the hated Treaty of Versailles, to rebuild the German army into the most powerful force on earth, to gather all the German peoples of Europe into one great empire, and then to seize vast new lands in the east. Living space, he called it, for the German race, won by conquest from the peoples he despised as inferior. It was all there, written down for anyone to read. The world simply refused to believe he meant it. So when Hitler began, openly and brazenly, to break the chains of Versailles, the other great powers did little to stop him. He rebuilt the German Air Force in secret, and then revealed it to the world. He brought back conscription and began rebuilding the army far beyond the treaty limits. He marched his soldiers back into the Rhineland, the buffer zone along the French border that the treaty had forbidden him to garrison. At each step, France and Britain protested, and at each step, they did nothing. They were haunted by the memory of the last war, by the millions of their own dead, and the thought of another such slaughter filled them with dread. They told themselves that Hitler's demands were reasonable, that a great nation could not be kept down forever, that if they gave him a little of what he wanted, he would be satisfied and the peace would hold. This was the policy that would come to be known as appeasement, and it would become one of the saddest lessons in all of history, the lesson that you cannot buy off an aggressor by feeding him, that each concession only whets the appetite for more. Hitler was not the only one testing the will of the world. In Africa, Mussolini sent his armies to conquer the ancient kingdom of Ethiopia, raining poison gas on tribesmen armed with spears, while the League of Nations wrung its hands and did nothing. In Asia, Japan had already seized the great region of Manchuria from China, setting up a puppet state and marching on toward a wider war. In Spain, a brutal civil war erupted, and Germany and Italy poured in men and weapons to help a fascist general seize power, using the Spanish battlefields as a testing ground for the new weapons and tactics of modern war. Everywhere, the dictators were on the march, and everywhere, the democracies hesitated, divided, frightened, and weak. The structure of peace that had been raised after the last war was crumbling, stone by stone, and the men who might have saved it stood by and watched it fall. By the year 1938, Hitler felt strong enough to begin the conquest he had always dreamed of, and he began with the land of his own birth. In March of that year, German troops crossed the border into Austria, and the small nation was swallowed whole into the German Empire. Its people, many of them cheering, welcoming the soldiers with flowers. The world protested, and the world did nothing. Emboldened, Hitler turned at once to his next target, the democratic nation of Czechoslovakia, a country that had been carved from the wreckage of the old empires, and that contained, along its western border, a large population of German-speaking people. Hitler demanded that this region be handed over to Germany. He stirred up unrest there, made furious speeches, and massed his armies on the frontier. And Europe held its breath, certain that this time it meant war. What followed was the highest and most tragic monument to the policy of appeasement. The leaders of Britain and France, desperate to avoid another great war, flew to the German city of Munich to meet with Hitler and Mussolini. The Czechs themselves were not even invited to the meeting that would decide their fate. There, in a single night, the four men carved up Czechoslovakia like a roast at a dinner table, granting Hitler the borderlands he demanded in exchange for his solemn promise that this was the last of his ambitions, that he wanted no more territory in Europe. The British Prime Minister flew home and stepped from his aircraft waving a piece of paper bearing Hitler's signature, declaring that he had secured peace for our time. The crowds cheered him, the world wept with relief, and it was all worthless. Within 6 months, Hitler tore up the agreement and sent his armies to seize the rest of Czechoslovakia. The parts that were not German at all, simply because he could and because no one had ever truly stopped him. At last, even the appeasers understood. The scales fell from their eyes, and a cold dread settled over the capitals of Europe. Hitler could not be trusted, could not be satisfied, could not be bought. He would keep taking until someone made him stop. Britain and France, shaken and ashamed, drew a line at last. They turned to the next nation in Hitler's path, the Republic of Poland, and gave it a solemn guarantee. If Germany attacked Poland, they declared, Britain and France would go to war. For the first time, the dictator had been told plainly that the next step would mean a general war. But Hitler did not believe them. He had watched them surrender again and again, and he was certain that when the moment came, they would surrender once more. Then came the news that stunned the entire world. For years, Hitler had raged against the communist Soviet Union, the great power to Germany's east, ruled by the Iron Dictator Joseph Stalin. The two regimes were sworn enemies, fascism and communism, locked in a hatred that seemed beyond all bridging. And yet, in August of 1939, their foreign ministers signed a pact of friendship, a treaty that astonished and frightened everyone who heard of it. The two great dictators had agreed not to fight one another. Behind the public treaty lay a secret one, in which they coldly divided the nations between them, agreeing to carve up Poland and the small countries of the Baltic, each taking his share like thieves splitting their loot. For Hitler, the pact was a masterstroke. It freed him to attack Poland without fear of being caught between two fronts, the nightmare that had doomed Germany in the last war. For Stalin, it bought precious time and a buffer of conquered land, and for Poland, caught between two ravenous empires that had just agreed to destroy it, the pact was a death sentence. Now, nothing stood in the way. In the last days of August, the German war machine gathered along the Polish frontier, a vast assembly of tanks and aircraft, and men such as the world had never seen. Hitler manufactured a final, cynical excuse, staging a fake attack on a German radio station near the border, dressing concentration camp prisoners in Polish uniforms, and leaving their bodies as evidence. It fooled no one, and it did not need to. The decision had already been made. In the cold grey hour before dawn on the 1st of September 1939, without any declaration of war, the German forces surged across the border into Poland. The long peace, the uneasy and broken peace that had lasted barely 20 years, was over. The Second World War had begun. The world had never seen war waged the way the Germans now waged it. The last great conflict had been a war of mud and stalemate, of men dug into trenches, who hurled themselves against barbed wire and machine guns, and died in their hundreds of thousands for a few yards of churned earth. But in the years of secret rearmament, German commanders had dreamed up something new, a way of war built around speed and shock and overwhelming force. They called it the Lightning War, and it fell upon Poland like a thunderbolt. First came the aircraft, screaming down out of the sky to shatter the Polish air force on the ground and to bomb the roads and railways into chaos. Then came the tanks, racing forward in fast columns, punching deep into the enemy rear before the defenders could even understand what was happening, encircling whole armies and cutting them off from supply and command. Behind them came the foot soldiers to mop up what remained. It was fast, brutal, and devastatingly effective. The Polish soldiers fought with desperate courage. But They were hopelessly outmatched. Their army was built for an older kind of war, their cavalry brave but useless against armoured steel, their cities open to the bombers that came without mercy. The capital, Warsaw, was pounded from the air and surrounded on the ground, its people sheltering in cellars as the bombs fell. Until at last, with the city in flames and the dead lying in the streets, it surrendered. And then, while Poland reeled under the German blow, a second catastrophe struck from the opposite direction. In keeping with the secret agreement, the armies of the Soviet Union crossed the eastern border and seized their share of the dying nation. Poland, attacked from both sides at once by two of the most powerful armies on earth, never had a chance. In barely a month, the country that had stood for only 20 years was wiped from the map, divided between Hitler and Stalin, and a long night of brutal occupation descended over its people, a night that would last for almost 6 terrible years. Britain and France, true to their word at last, had declared war on Germany within days of the invasion. But declaring war and waging it were two very different things. The French had a great army, but it was a cautious one, built to defend rather than to attack, sheltering behind a vast line of fortresses they had built along their border. The British army was small, and the great bulk of its strength lay in its navy and its young air force. Neither nation was ready to launch the kind of headlong assault that might have saved Poland, and in truth, Poland fell so quickly that no help could have arrived in time. So as autumn turned to winter, a strange and eerie lull settled over the Western Front. The two sides faced each other across the frontier, and almost nothing happened. The bombers did not come, the armies did not move. People began to call it the phony war, the war that was not a war, and some even let themselves hope that it might somehow fizzle out into a negotiated peace. But out at sea, the war was real enough. Beneath the cold grey waters of the Atlantic, German submarines, the dreaded U-boats, had already begun their hunt. Britain was an island nation that could not feed itself, that depended for its very survival on the great convoys of merchant ships bringing food and fuel and supplies across the ocean. The U-boats prowled the shipping lanes like wolves, striking without warning, and the long, silent, deadly battle of the Atlantic had begun, a battle that would grind on for years, and that Britain could not afford to lose. And in the frozen north, another small war flared. Stalin, wanting to push his borders outward, demanded territory from the tiny nation of Finland, and when the Finns refused, the Soviet armies invaded. The world expected the giant to crush the small nation in days. Instead, the Finns, fighting on skis through forests white with snow, masters of their own bitter terrain, held off the Soviet hordes for months, inflicting humiliating losses before sheer weight of numbers finally forced them to give up a piece of their land. It was a small war, far from the centre of things, but it taught a watching world 2 lessons. It showed that a determined people could resist even an overwhelming foe, and it revealed that the great Soviet army, for all its size, was clumsy and poorly led, a discovery that Hitler would file away in his mind for the day. Not far off, when he would turn against his Eastern partner, the strange quiet of the phony war ended in the spring of 1940, and when it ended with shattering force. Hitler struck first in the north, sending his forces to seize Denmark and Norway, partly to protect the vital iron ore that flowed to his factories from the Scandinavian mines, and partly to deny those shores to the British. Denmark fell in a single day. Norway fought longer, with British and French help. But in the end, the Germans prevailed there too, and another 2 nations passed under Hitler's shadow. Yet, all of this was only a prelude. For Hitler's true target, the prize he had wanted from the very beginning, was the conquest of Western Europe itself, and above all the defeat of France, the old enemy, the nation that had humiliated Germany at Versailles. In May of 1940, he unleashed the full fury of his army to the west. The German plan was a bold and brilliant gamble. The French and British expected the main blow to come through the flat plains of Belgium, as it had in the last war, and so they rushed their best armies north to meet it. But this was a feint. The real strike came farther south, through a region called the Ardennes, a dense and hilly forest that the French generals had believed no large army could ever cross. Through this supposedly impassable country, the Germans poured the bulk of their tanks. A great armoured fist that burst out of the woods, crossed the river beyond, and raced for the sea, slicing clean through the heart of the Allied armies and cutting them in two. The effect was catastrophic. The finest French and British forces, who had advanced into Belgium expecting the enemy in front of them, suddenly found the enemy behind them. As well, their lines of supply severed, their whole position collapsing into chaos. In a matter of days, the campaign was lost. The trapped Allied armies were driven back toward the coast of the English Channel, pressed into a shrinking pocket around the small French port of Dunkirk, with the sea at their backs and the Germans closing in. It seemed that the entire British army, and much of the French, was about to be destroyed or captured, a disaster from which Britain might never recover. What followed became one of the most extraordinary episodes of the entire war. The German tanks, for reasons still argued over to this day, paused in their advance. And into that pause the British poured every effort to rescue their trapped men. Warships and ferries went, but so did a vast and ragged fleet of little civilian boats. Fishing vessels and pleasure craft and river barges sailed by ordinary men across the dangerous water to lift the soldiers from the beaches. Under the bombs and the strafing aircraft, day after day, more than 300,000 men were carried back to England. They left their guns and their tanks behind them on the sand. They came home beaten, exhausted and stripped of their weapons, but they came home and the army was saved, and out of a terrible defeat the British drew a strange and stubborn pride, the spirit, they called it, of Dunkirk. For France, however, there would be no miracle. With its best armies gone, its lines broken, its government in flight, the nation reeled toward collapse. The Germans drove south, and the roads filled with millions of terrified refugees fleeing before them. Civilians clogging the highways, strafed from the air, carrying their children and a few possession as though away from the advancing storm. As France crumbled, Mussolini, eager to share in the spoils of what looked like certain victory, declared war and sent his Italian armies across the southern border, a final blow against a nation already on its knees. In June of 1940, barely 6 weeks after the offensive had begun, the unthinkable happened. France, the great power that had held the Germans for 4 bloody years in the last war, surrendered. Hitler insisted that the surrender be signed in the very same railway carriage, brought out specially for the purpose, in which Germany had signed its own humiliation in 1918. He danced a little jig of triumph for the cameras. The old enemy was beaten, and Hitler stood as the master of Western Europe. A new France was carved out of the ruin. The northern half of the country, including Paris, was occupied directly by German troops. The southern half was left under a collaborationist French government, based in the spa town of Vichy that did the conqueror's bidding. But not all of France submitted. A little-known general named Charles de Gaulle escaped to London, and there, over the radio, he made a defiant broadcast to his fallen countrymen, declaring that France had lost a battle but had not lost the war, that the flame of French resistance must not and would not be extinguished. Few heard him at first, but his words planted a seed, and across occupied Europe, in secret cellars and quiet forests, the long and dangerous work of resistance began. Still, in that dark summer of 1940, such hopes seemed faint indeed. Hitler had conquered nearly all of Europe. Only one nation still stood against him. Alone now, across a narrow strip of water, and it was upon that one nation that the dictator now turned his terrible gaze. That summer, Britain stood alone against the conqueror of Europe, and to most observers around the world, its position looked hopeless. Its army had escaped from Dunkirk, but it had escaped with little more than its life, leaving its weapons on the beaches of France. The mighty German war machine, flush with victory, gathered along the coast just across the channel, that narrow ribbon of grey water, barely 20 miles wide. Many in Britain, and many more abroad, expected the island to seek terms, to make peace with the master of the continent rather than face the storm alone. But Britain now had a new leader, and he was a man who would never, under any circumstances, even consider surrender. His name was Winston Churchill. Churchill was an old man by the standards of the day, a stout, growling, cigar-smoking veteran of politics, who had spent years in the wilderness. Ignored and out of favour, warning of the German danger when no one wished to hear it. Now, in the hour of crisis, the nation turned to him, and he rose to meet the moment as few men in history ever have. He could not offer his people victory, not yet, nor any easy hope. What he offered them was words, and a will of iron, and an absolute refusal to bend. He told them he had nothing to give but blood, toil, tears and sweat. He told them that even if the enemy landed and fought in their streets and their fields, they would never surrender. And that if the British Empire lasted 1,000 years, men would still say that this had been its finest hour. His voice, carried into every home by radio, gave the frightened people a strength they had not known they possessed. He gave them, above all, the conviction that they could endure. But will alone could not stop an invasion. Before Hitler's soldiers could cross the Channel, he needed to destroy the British Air Force and seize control of the skies, for no fleet of barges, full of troops, could survive the attacks of an air force still in being. And so, through the long summer and into the autumn of 1940, the first great battle ever fought entirely in the air took place over the fields and towns of southern England. The German Air Force came in waves, hundreds of bombers and fighters, darkening the sky, and against them rose the young pilots of the British Air Force in their nimble fighter planes, the famous Spitfires and Hurricanes, day after day, in swirling battles, high above the patchwork countryside. These handful of young men, many of them barely out of school, climbed again and again to meet the enemy, exhausted, outnumbered, knowing that, on them alone, the survival of their nation depended. They were so few, and they carried so much, that Churchill said of them words that have never been forgotten, that never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The young pilots held against all odds, fighting at the edge of exhaustion, helped by a new and secret invention that let them see the enemy coming. Before he arrived, they bled the German Air Force white, shooting down more aircraft than they lost, until at last the Germans gave up their attempt to win command of the air. The invasion was called off, postponed, and then quietly abandoned. Hitler had suffered his first defeat, and the island had survived. But the failure to break the Air Force did not end the suffering. Unable to win in daylight, the Germans turned to a campaign of terror by night, sending their bombers against the cities themselves, against London above all, in the long ordeal that the British called the Blitz. Night after night, for months on end, the bombs rained down. Whole streets were flattened. Whole streets through the dark. Fires raged, and the people of London, sheltered in cellars and basements, and deep in the tunnels of the Underground Railway, emerging each morning to find their city smashed and burning, and going about their business anyway, with a grim and stubborn humour that became legendary. Tens of thousands of civilians died in the bombing, ordinary men, women, and children, killed in their homes far from any battlefield. The great cathedral of the capital stood wreathed in smoke and flame, and its survival, its dome, rising defiant above the burning city, became a symbol of a people who would not break. The Blitz was meant to shatter British morale, to terrify the nation into surrender. It did the opposite. It hardened the people's resolve, bound them together in shared suffering, and made the war a thing not of armies alone, but of the whole population. Britain, battered and bombed and alone, had endured the worst that Hitler could throw at it, and it was still standing. For the first time, the dictator had been checked. He could not cross that narrow sea. And so, frustrated in the West, he turned his restless mind toward the East, toward the vast lands of his nominal ally, the Soviet Union, where he had always meant, in the end, to make his greatest conquest of all. While Britain endured its ordeal at home, the war was spreading far beyond the shores of Europe into the sun-baked deserts of North Africa and across the blue waters of the Mediterranean. It was Mussolini who opened this new front. The Italian dictator, hungry for an empire of his own and jealous of his German partner's triumphs, sent his armies eastward from the Italian colony of Libya against the British forces guarding Egypt and the vital Suez Canal, the great waterway that was the lifeline of the British Empire. But Mussolini's armies, for all their numbers and their grand parades, proved poorly led and poorly equipped, and the smaller British force not only stopped them but flung them back, capturing tens of thousands of Italian prisoners and driving deep into Libya. The Italian adventure collapsed into humiliation, and it began to seem that Mussolini's much-vaunted new Roman Empire was a hollow thing. Hitler could not allow his ally to be utterly destroyed, for the loss of North Africa would expose the underbelly of his new European empire. So he sent help in the form of a small but deadly armoured force, and a commander who would become one of the most famous soldiers of the war. A bold and brilliant tank general named Erwin Rommel. Rommel arrived in the desert and at once went on the attack. And with his handful of German tanks and his Italian allies, he reversed the situation, driving the British back across the burning sands toward Egypt. So began the long seesaw war of the desert, a campaign unlike any other in the conflict, fought across a vast and empty wilderness of rock and sand, where there were no cities to capture and no people to defend, only distance and heat, and the endless problem of supply. The armies surged back and forth across hundreds of miles, advancing until they outran their fuel and water. Then, falling back to begin again, Rommel earned the grudging respect even of his enemies, who called him the Desert Fox. And for many months the fate of Egypt and the Suez Canal hung in the balance. The Mediterranean became a great theatre of war in its own right, a contest of fleets and islands and convoys. The British Navy fought to keep the sea lanes open and to choke off the supplies that crossed from Italy to Rommel's armies in Africa. The tiny island of Malta, lying squarely across those supply routes, became one of the most bombed places on Earth, its people enduring siege and starvation and relentless air attack, holding on with a courage that won them lasting honour, because, so long as Malta held, the British could strike at the enemy's lifeline. And meanwhile, on the European mainland, Mussolini blundered into yet another disaster. Eager to match Hitler's conquests, he launched an invasion of Greece, expecting an easy victory. Instead, the Greeks fought back ferociously, drove the Italians back into the mountains of Albania, and turned Mussolini's adventure into another embarrassing failure. Once again, Hitler was forced to rescue his floundering partner, and once again he did so with overwhelming force. In the spring of 1941, German armies stormed into the Balkans, swiftly overrunning Yugoslavia and then Greece, where a small British and Commonwealth force sent to help the Greeks was beaten and forced into another desperate evacuation by sea. The conquest was capped by an audacious airborne assault on the Greek island of Crete, where German paratroopers descended from the sky in their thousands to seize the island in fierce and bloody fighting. By the early summer of 1941, Hitler's domination of Europe seemed almost complete, from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. From the Atlantic coast of France to the borders of the Soviet Union, the swastika flew over nation after conquered nation. He had subdued or allied with almost the entire continent. Yet for all these victories, the war was not won, and Hitler knew it. Britain still stood defiant across the Channel, refusing to make peace, kept alive by its navy and its empire. And by the growing flood of supplies it was beginning to receive from the still neutral United States, whose president, Franklin Roosevelt, watched the European struggle with deep concern, and had begun, by every means short of war, to aid the embattled British. So long as Britain held out, Hitler could not rest secure. But the dictator's mind was no longer truly fixed on Britain. For years, his deepest ambition had been the conquest of the East, the seizure of the vast and fertile lands of the Soviet Union, the destruction of the communist regime he hated, and the winning of living space for the German race upon the ruins of the peoples he intended to enslave. The pact he had signed with Stalin had always been a thing of convenience, never of trust. And now, with his back turned on the unconquered island behind him, Hitler prepared to commit the greatest gamble of his career, and the greatest crime, by hurling his armies against the largest nation on earth. In the early hours of the 22nd of June, 1941, the largest invasion in the history of the world began, along a front that stretched for 1,000 miles, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. More than 3 million German and Allied soldiers surged across the border into the Soviet Union. With them came thousands of tanks and aircraft, and hundreds of thousands of horses, an army of staggering size, the greatest force ever assembled for war. Stalin, who had refused to believe the many warnings that an attack was coming, who had trusted in his pact with Hitler far longer than any sensible man should have, was caught utterly by surprise. The Soviet armies along the border were shattered in the first days. The Soviet Air Force was destroyed largely on the ground, and the German columns drove deep into Soviet territory, repeating on a vast scale the lightning victories they had won in the West, encircling and capturing entire Soviet armies, hundreds of thousands of men at a stroke. It seemed, in those first weeks, that the Soviet Union might collapse as swiftly as France had done. The Germans advanced with terrifying speed, capturing great cities, overrunning huge tracts of land, taking prisoners in numbers almost beyond counting. Hitler and his generals were certain that the campaign would be finished before winter, that one more great blow would bring the whole rotten structure, as they saw it, crashing down. But the Soviet Union was not France. It was a land of almost limitless space, and that space swallowed the advancing armies. The farther the Germans pushed, the longer their supply lines grew, the more their tanks and trucks broke down on the rough and endless roads. And the Soviet people, for all the brutality of their own dictator, did not collapse. They fell back and kept fighting. They tore up their factories and shipped them by rail far to the east, beyond the reach of the German armies. And there, in new cities behind the mountains, they began to build tanks and guns again, in ever greater numbers. Another reason daffodils, and there was another reason the conquest would not be the easy thing Hitler had imagined, a reason that lay in the very nature of the war he had chosen to wage. This was no ordinary campaign of conquest. In Hitler's mind, it was a war of annihilation, a war against peoples he regarded as subhuman, to be enslaved or exterminated to make room for German settlers. Behind the advancing armies came special killing squads, whose task was the murder of the Jews, the communists, and other targeted groups of the conquered lands. In town after town, they carried out massacres on a scale that the world had not yet imagined possible, herding their victims to the edge of pits and shooting them in their thousands. The cruelty of the German occupation, the deliberate starvation of prisoners, the burning of villages, the mass murder had a consequence that Hitler had not foreseen. It taught the conquered peoples that there could be no surrender, no mercy, no life under German rule. And so it drove them not into submission, but into a desperate and ferocious resistance, a partisan war in the forests and the marshes that gnawed at the German rear and would never let them rest. As the autumn rains came, the roads of the Soviet Union dissolved into seas of mud that swallowed the German tanks and slowed the advance to a crawl. And then, behind the mud, came the cold. The German soldiers, who had been promised victory before winter, found themselves still in the field as the temperature plunged far below freezing, without warm clothing, without proper shelter, their weapons jamming in the frost, their vehicles frozen solid. They had reached the very outskirts of the Soviet capital, Moscow. From the forward positions, some German soldiers could glimpse, through the snow and the haze, the spires of the great city. They never reached it. In the bitter December of 1941, with the German army frozen and exhausted, at the gates, the Soviets, reinforced by fresh and hardy troops brought from the Far East, launched a furious counterattack and drove the invaders back from the capital. The myth of German invincibility was broken at last. The lightning war had failed. Hitler had not won his quick victory, and now he was trapped as Napoleon had been trapped before him, in the immensity and the cruelty of the Russian winter. In a war he could not finish and could not afford to lose. The Eastern Front, as it came to be called, would become the greatest and most terrible battlefield of the entire war, a struggle of a scale and savagery that dwarfed all the rest. Here, far from the eyes of the Western world, the bulk of the German army would be locked in a death grip with the armies of the Soviet Union for nearly 4 years, and here the majority of the war's soldiers would fight and die. The numbers defy the imagination. Millions upon millions would perish on these endless plains, soldiers and civilians alike, in battles that consumed whole armies, in sieges that starved whole cities, in a war waged without mercy on either side. The fate of the entire conflict would, more than anywhere else, be decided here, in the blood and snow of the East. And the war that Hitler had begun as a swift and glorious conquest had become, instead, the long road to his own destruction, while the German armies froze before Moscow. The war that had begun in Europe was about to become truly global, and the spark would come from the far side of the world, from the Empire of Japan. For years Japan had been pursuing its own dream of empire in Asia, a dream of dominating the entire region. of seizing its resources and its lands, and reducing its peoples to servitude. Japan had already been at war in China for years, a brutal and grinding conflict in which Japanese armies had committed terrible atrocities against the Chinese people. But China was vast, and the war there had no end in sight. And Japan, an island nation poor in the raw materials its industries and its armies needed, hungered above all for oil and rubber and metal, resources that lay in the rich European colonies of Southeast Asia, now left vulnerable by the fall of their masters in Europe. There was one great obstacle in Japan's path, and that was the United States. America watched Japan's aggression with deep disapproval. And to pressure Japan into halting its conquests, the American government cut off the sale of oil and other vital materials on which Japan depended. To the proud and militaristic leaders of Japan, this left a stark and fateful choice. They could back down, abandon their dreams of empire, and submit to American demands. Or they could seize what they needed by force, striking south to grab the oil and the resources of Southeast Asia, and accepting that this would mean war with the United States. They chose war. And they decided that their best hope against an enemy so much larger and richer than themselves was to begin that war with a single shattering blow to cripple American power in the Pacific before it could be brought to bear. The blow fell on a quiet Sunday morning, the 7th of December, 1941, on the great American naval base at Pearl Harbor, in the Hawaiian Islands. There, in the warm Pacific dawn, the bulk of the American fleet lay peacefully at anchor, its sailors waking to an ordinary Sunday. Out of the morning sky came waves of Japanese aircraft. Launched in secret from carriers that had crossed thousands of miles of ocean undetected, they fell upon the unsuspecting fleet with bombs and torpedoes, and in less than 2 hours they wrought devastation. Battleships were sunk or set ablaze, aircraft were destroyed on the ground, and thousands of American servicemen were killed. It was a stunning tactical success, the very blow the Japanese had hoped for, but it was also one of the greatest strategic blunders in all of history. For the attack on Pearl Harbor did not cripple America's will. It united and enraged a nation that had been deeply divided about the war, sweeping away in a single morning all the reluctance and the isolationism, and binding the American people together in a fierce and unanimous determination to fight. The following day, the United States declared war on Japan, and a few days after that, Hitler, in an act of folly that has puzzled historians ever since, honoured his alliance with Japan and declared war on America as well. With that, the conflict became a true world war, joining the struggle in Europe to the struggle in Asia, and bringing the immense industrial might of the United States fully into the fight. But the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor was not American triumph. It was a season of disaster as Japan, in the months that followed, unleashed a whirlwind of conquest across the Pacific and Southeast Asia that astonished the world. One after another, the strongholds of the Western powers fell. The great British naval base at Singapore, thought to be impregnable, surrendered in a humiliating defeat. Tens of thousands of its defenders marched off into a brutal captivity. The American forces in the Philippines were overwhelmed after a desperate defense, their survivors subjected to a death march of unspeakable cruelty. Island after island, colony after colony, fell to the advancing Japanese until their new empire stretched across a vast expanse of ocean and land, from the borders of India to the approaches of Australia. For the Japanese, it was a moment of intoxicating triumph. In a few short months, they had seemingly swept the Western powers from Asia and built one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. But their leaders, like Hitler in his confidence, had made a fatal miscalculation. They had not destroyed the heart of American power. For the American aircraft carriers, the most important ships of all, had by chance been away from Pearl Harbor on the day of the attack and had survived. And they had awakened a giant whose industrial strength was beyond anything the Japanese could match, a nation that could build ships and planes and produce weapons in quantities that would, in time, simply overwhelm them. The Japanese had won a great gamble at the start, but they had bound themselves to a long war against an enemy they could not in the end defeat. The tide of their conquests had a limit, and that limit was about to be reached. There is a part of this story that must be told with care and with sorrow, for it is the darkest chapter not only of this war, but perhaps of all human history. As the German Empire spread across Europe, it carried with it a campaign of murder unlike anything the world had ever known, a deliberate, organised, industrial effort to destroy an entire people. From the very beginning, hatred of the Jews had been at the centre of Hitler's beliefs, and as his power grew, that hatred moved from words to laws, from laws to violence, and at last, in the shadow of the war, to systematic extermination. The Jews of Germany had first been stripped of their rights, their property, their place in society. Then, as Germany conquered the lands of Eastern Europe, where millions more Jewish people lived, they were herded into sealed and crowded ghettos, walled off from the world, left to die slowly of hunger and disease. And then the killing began in earnest. In the conquered East, the killing squads that followed the armies shot Jewish communities by the hundreds of thousands, village by village, at the edges of pits dug in the forests. But even this monstrous slaughter was not, to the men who ran it, efficient enough. And so they devised something worse, something for which human language has no adequate words. They built camps, vast factories of death, fitted with chambers in which human beings could be killed in great numbers, and ovens to dispose of the bodies. To these camps, from every corner of occupied Europe, they shipped their victims in sealed trains, packed into cattle cars without food or water or air, men, women, children, the old and the sick and the newborn, transported across a continent for the sole purpose of being murdered on arrival. The largest of these camps became a name that would forever stand for the deepest evil of which human beings are capable. There, and in the other camps, and in the ghettos, and the killing pits, some 6 million Jewish people were murdered, among them 1.5 million children. 2 out of every 3 Jews in all of Europe were killed. An entire world of communities, cultures, families, and lives, built up over 1,000 years, was deliberately and methodically destroyed. The Jews were the central target of this campaign, but they were not the only ones who perished in it. The same machinery of murder consumed others whom the regime had marked as unworthy of life. Hundreds of thousands of Roma people were killed. The disabled, the mentally ill, the sick, were murdered in a secret program that the regime had begun even before the war, deeming such lives a burden. Political prisoners, prisoners of conscience, religious dissenters, prisoners of certain other groups, all were swept into the camps and the killing. Soviet prisoners of war died by the millions in German captivity, deliberately starved and worked to death. The total toll of this organised murder, beyond the battlefield, beyond the bombing, reached into many millions of innocent human beings, killed not in the heat of battle, but in cold and calculated cruelty. What makes this horror so difficult to comprehend is not only its scale, but its nature. It was not the work of wild mobs or the chaos of battle. It was planned in quiet offices by educated men, organised with bureaucratic precision, carried out by ordinary clerks and railway officials, and guards who went home in the evening to their families. It was, in its way, a perversion of the very order and efficiency in which the modern world took such pride, turned to the single end of murder. For a long time, the world outside knew little of what was happening behind the barbed wire, and even when reports began to filter out, many found them too terrible to believe. It was only at the very end of the war, when the advancing armies of the Allies reached the camps and flung open their gates, that the full and undeniable truth was revealed, and hardened soldiers wept at what they found, and the world was forced to look upon the depths to which it had descended. We tell this part of the story not to dwell on horror, but because it must never be forgotten. The men who built those camps wished their victims to vanish without a trace, their names erased, their very existence denied. To remember them, to speak their fate plainly and without flinching, is itself a kind of defiance, a refusal to let the murderers have the final word. And it is a warning, carried across the years to every generation that follows, of where hatred can lead when it is given power, of what becomes possible when a people is taught to see other human beings as less than human, a host of golden daffodils. Among the unending darkness there were small lights, ordinary people who risked everything to hide their neighbours, to smuggle children to safety, to resist in whatever small way they could. They could not stop the slaughter. But they remind us that even in the worst of times, the choice between cruelty and compassion remained, and that some, against all the pressure of their age, chose to be kind. Let their memory rest gently now, alongside the memory of all those who were lost. For nearly 3 years, the war had seemed to flow in only one direction. The dictators had conquered and conquered, and their enemies had reeled from defeat to defeat. But in the middle years of the war, in a series of great battles fought across the world, within the space of a few months, the tide turned at last. The first turning came on the water, in the vast emptiness of the Central Pacific. The Japanese, drunk on their early triumphs, sought to lure out and destroy the American carriers that had survived Pearl Harbor, and they laid a trap near a tiny American outpost called Midway. But the Americans had achieved a great secret advantage. They had broken the Japanese codes, and they knew the trap was coming. In a battle fought entirely by aircraft launched from carriers far over the horizon, where the great ships never even saw one another, American dive bombers found the Japanese fleet at the perfect moment, and in a few devastating minutes sent 4 of Japan's irreplaceable aircraft carriers to the bottom of the sea. It was a catastrophe from which the Japanese Navy never fully recovered. The Japanese tide of conquest, which had rolled across the Pacific for 6 months, was halted at last, and from that day forward the Americans would advance and the Japanese would retreat. Even more decisive was the titanic struggle unfolding far away, on the Eastern Front, in a city on the banks of a great river, a city that bore the name of the Soviet dictator himself, Stalingrad. Hitler, having failed to take Moscow, had launched a new offensive in the summer of 1942, driving south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, and his armies became fixed upon the capture of this one city, which grew into a matter of pride for both dictators, a place where neither would yield. What followed was perhaps the most terrible battle in the history of warfare. For months, German and Soviet soldiers fought for the ruined city, street by street, house by house, room by room, in a nightmare of rubble and fire and freezing cold. They fought in sewers and cellars and the shells of factories, in close and savage combat, where a single building might change hands many times in a day. The city was reduced to a wasteland of broken stone, and still they fought on amid the ruins with a ferocity that consumed lives by the hundreds of thousands. Then, as winter closed in once more, the Soviets sprang their trap. They had quietly gathered fresh armies on the flanks of the city, and now they struck, smashing through the weak forces guarding the German rear and closing a great ring around the entire German army fighting in Stalingrad. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were suddenly surrounded, cut off, trapped in the frozen ruins as their supplies dwindled and the cold deepened. Hitler forbade them to break out or to surrender, ordering them to fight to the last man, and so they died of cold and hunger and Soviet shells until the survivors, starving and frostbitten, gave up at last. An entire German army, one of the finest in the world, had been destroyed. It was a blow from which Germany would never recover, the moment when the war in the East turned irreversibly against Hitler, and from which his armies would do nothing thereafter but retreat, slowly and bloodily, across the thousands of miles back toward their own homeland. And in the deserts of North Africa, in the same season, the third great turning came. There, the seesaw war had swung in the Germans' favour once more, and Rommel had driven the British back deep into Egypt, almost to the gates of the canal, until it seemed that the whole British position in the Middle East might collapse. But the British rebuilt their strength, brought in a new and determined commander, and gathered an overwhelming force. At a place called El Alamein, they launched a massive assault against Rommel's lines, and after days of brutal fighting they broke through, sent the Germans into a long retreat that would never be reversed. It was the first great land victory the British had won against the Germans in the whole war, and Churchill declared that before it the Allies had never had a victory, and after it they never had a defeat. Soon afterward, American and British forces landed in the west of North Africa, and the German and Italian armies, caught between two advancing enemies, were squeezed into a shrinking pocket and finally forced to surrender. The whole of North Africa was cleared of the enemy, and the southern door into Europe was thrown open, within the span of a single half-year. Then, the entire course of the war had changed. At Midway, the Japanese advance had been stopped. At Stalingrad, the German army had suffered its mortal wound. At El Alamein and in North Africa, the Western Allies had won their first clear victories and gained a foothold from which to strike at Europe itself. The dark years of unbroken Axis triumph were over. The initiative had passed, slowly but surely, to the other side. The road ahead would still be long, and it would be paid for in oceans of blood, for the enemy was far from beaten and would fight with the desperate fury of a cornered beast. But the outcome, which had once seemed so much in doubt, was beginning to take shape. The tide had turned, and now it would flow, inch by bloody inch, toward the downfall of the men who had set the world on fire. With the tide turned, the Allies began the long and grinding work of pushing the enemy back on every front, a struggle that would fill the year 1943 and beyond with hard fighting and slow advance. The first blow against the European mainland fell upon Italy. From their bases in North Africa, the Allies leapt across the sea to the island of Sicily and then onto the toe of Italy itself. The shock of invasion shattered the last of Mussolini's authority. The Italian people, weary of a war they had never truly wanted, turned against the dictator who had led them into it, and Mussolini was arrested and his government overthrown. Italy switched sides, abandoning its German ally and joining the Allies. But Hitler would not let Italy go so easily. German troops poured into the country, seized control, freed Mussolini in a daring raid, and turned Italy into a battlefield. The Allied advance up the long and mountainous Italian peninsula proved bitterly slow and costly. the Germans defending every ridge and river with skill and stubbornness, so that the campaign in Italy ground on, hard and bloody, almost to the very end of the war, far out over the dark Atlantic. Meanwhile, the long and silent battle for the sea lanes reached its climax. For years, the German submarines had hunted the convoys, sinking ship after ship, threatening to starve Britain into surrender, and there were months when the losses were so heavy that the outcome hung in real doubt. But slowly the Allies gained the upper hand. New tactics, new weapons, aircraft that could range far out to sea, and the breaking of the German codes all combined to turn the tables. The hunters became the hunted, and the U-boats began to be destroyed faster than they could be built. By the middle of 1943, the great threat had been mastered, and the vital ocean highway between America and Britain was secured, allowing the immense flood of men and machines from American factories to pour across to the staging ground from which the liberation of Europe would one day be launched. And in the skies over Germany itself, a new and terrible kind of war was being waged, the great campaign of strategic bombing, night after night. And increasingly by day as well, vast fleets of British and American bombers crossed into German airspace to rain destruction on the cities and factories of the enemy, seeking to cripple the German war machine and to break the will of the German people. The cost to the airmen was appalling, for the German defences were fierce, and tens of thousands of young men died in the cold and burning skies. And the cost to the cities below was beyond reckoning. Whole districts were reduced to rubble, and in some of the great raids, the fires combined into vast firestorms that consumed everything in their path and killed tens of thousands of civilians in a single night. The bombing remains one of the most debated aspects of the war, terrible in its toll, uncertain in its results, but it tied down great quantities of German guns and aircraft that were desperately needed at the front, and it brought the war home, at last, to the nation that had unleashed it on so many others. In the Pacific, the Americans began their own long road back. And it was a road that led across thousands of miles of ocean, from island to island. The Japanese had fortified the scattered islands of their conquered empire, and rather than assault every one of them, the Americans devised a strategy of leaping from island to island, seizing the key positions they needed for airfields and harbours, and bypassing the rest, leaving the great Japanese garrisons to wither, cut off and useless, behind the advancing American line. Each island that had to be taken was won at a fearful price, for the Japanese soldiers fought with a fanatical refusal to surrender, defending their positions to the last man, hiding in caves and bunkers, so that the Marines who came ashore had to dig them out one by one in close and merciless combat. The names of these islands, small specks of jungle and coral most people had never heard of, became written in blood in the memory of a generation, step by step, at terrible cost. The Americans drew closer to the home islands of Japan. On the Eastern Front, the greatest land war in history ground on, and after Stalingrad, the Germans tried once more to seize the initiative, launching a huge offensive against a great bulge in the Soviet line, in what became the largest tank battle ever fought. But the Soviets were ready, and they absorbed the German blow and shattered it, and from that point forward, the German army in the east did nothing but retreat. The Soviet armies, now vast and growing, ever stronger, supplied by their own immense factories and by a river of trucks and equipment sent from America, rolled forward across the ruined land, liberating their own occupied territory mile by bloody mile, and beginning the long march that would carry them, in time, all the way to the heart of Germany itself. On every front, in Italy, and the Atlantic and the air and the Pacific and the vast eastern plains. The enemy was being pressed back. The Allies were winning, but the hardest blow of all, the great assault that would open the door to the liberation of Western Europe, was still to come, and it was being prepared, in secret, across the narrow waters of the English Channel. While the great battles raged across the world, another war was being fought far from any front line, in the factories and the fields and the kitchens of every nation caught up in the conflict. This was the war of the home front, and in a struggle of this scale, it mattered nearly as much as the fighting itself. For this was a total war, a war that demanded everything from everyone, that turned entire nations into vast machines for the production of weapons and the feeding of armies. The old line between soldier and civilian blurred and nearly vanished. A worker at a factory bench, building the engines for aircraft, was as much a part of the war as the pilot who flew them. And so, in country after country, ordinary life was transformed almost beyond recognition. The factories were the beating heart of it. In America, above all, safe behind its great oceans, the industrial might of the nation was turned wholly to war, and the results were staggering. Shipyards that had once taken months to build a single vessel learned to launch them in days. Assembly lines that had built motor cars now poured out tanks and aircraft, and guns in numbers that no enemy could hope to match. It was this flood of production, more perhaps than any battle, that doomed the dictators, for they had begun a war against the greatest industrial power the world had ever seen. And with so many young men gone away to fight, it was the women who stepped into the factories to do the work. Millions of them, taking up jobs that had always been thought beyond them, building the engines of war with skill and determination, and discovering in themselves a strength and a capability that would change forever the way the world thought about what women could do. For ordinary daffodils, for ordinary families, the war meant 1,000 small hardships and adjustments. Food grew scarce, for the ships that might have carried it were needed for other things, and the men who might have farmed it were away at war. And so governments rationed it out. So much butter, so much meat, so much sugar to each person, no more. And people learned to make do, to stretch a little, a long way, to grow vegetables in their gardens and their parks and any patch of spare ground. They learned to save and to mend and to waste nothing, to give up the small luxuries they had once taken for granted. In the bombed cities, they learned to live with the nightly fear of the raids, to black out their windows so that no light would guide the enemy bombers, to hurry to the shelters when the sirens wailed, and to carry on the next morning as though nothing had happened, going to work past the smoking ruins of the houses that had stood the day before. And everywhere, in every nation, families waited and feared for the men who had gone away. The mother who scanned the casualty lists in the newspaper. The wife who lived for the arrival of a letter and dreaded the arrival of a telegram. The children who grew up with a father they barely knew, a face in a photograph on the mantelpiece. For some, the dreaded news came. The knock at the door, the brief and formal words of regret, and a family's whole world was changed in an instant. Across the warring nations, in towns and villages, beyond counting, this same grief was repeated millions upon millions of times, a private sorrow at the heart of each of those vast public numbers. For every soldier who fell was someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father, mourned in a quiet house far from the field where he had died. Yet the home front was not all hardship and grief. There was also a strange and powerful sense of common purpose, of a whole people pulling together toward a single end, that many who lived through it would remember, oddly, as among the most meaningful times of their lives. strangers helped one another. Neighbours shared what little they had. The barriers of class and station softened a little in the shared experience of danger and sacrifice. People found in themselves reserves of endurance and good humour they had not known they possessed, and they took a quiet pride in their small daily contributions to a cause far larger than themselves. The war asked everything of these ordinary people, and somehow, in their millions, they gave it. They are not the figures we usually remember when we think of the war, the generals and the leaders and the great battles. But without them, without their labour and their patience, and their stubborn refusal to break, none of the rest would have been possible at all, alongside the great armies and the home fronts. The war was also fought in the shadows, a secret war of spies and codebreakers and resistance fighters, hidden from the public eye, often unknown even to those fighting in the open, yet at times decisive in shaping the outcome. In the occupied lands of Europe, beneath the surface of submission, a current of resistance ran deep and dangerous. From the first days of conquest, ordinary men and women who refused to accept the rule of the conqueror began, quietly and at terrible risk, to fight back in the only ways they could. They printed secret newspapers to keep the truth alive. They sheltered hunted men, downed airmen, escaped prisoners, and those marked for death, hiding them in attics and cellars and barns, passing them along secret chains of safe houses toward freedom. They gathered information and smuggled it out to the Allies. And as the war went on, they took up arms, sabotaging railways and factories, ambushing patrols, blowing up bridges, harrying the occupiers, and tying down soldiers who were desperately needed elsewhere. The work of resistance was unimaginably dangerous. Those who were caught faced torture and death, and not only themselves, for the occupiers practiced collective punishment. And a single act of sabotage might be answered by the murder of hostages, the burning of a village, the destruction of a whole community. To resist was to gamble, not only one's own life, but the lives of others, and those who chose to do it carried a weight that few of us can imagine. And yet they did it, in their thousands, across every occupied nation, in the forests of Eastern Europe, where partisan bands waged open war, in the cities of France, and the mountains of the Balkans, and the fjords of Norway. They could not, on their own, defeat the conqueror, but they kept the flame of freedom alive. In the long dark years, they gave hope to peoples who had none, and when the day of liberation came at last, they rose up to help drive the occupiers from their land. The secret war was fought, too, by the spies and agents who were slipped into occupied territory to organize the resistance, to gather intelligence, to prepare the ground for the eventual return of the Allied armies. Men and women parachuted into enemy-held lands in the dead of night, carrying false papers and hidden radios, living a double life under the very noses of the enemy, knowing that a single slip, a single betrayal, meant capture and death. Their courage was of a particular and lonely kind, far from the comradeship of the battlefield, sustained only by their own resolve. Many were caught, many died, but their work helped to weave the web of resistance that would prove so valuable when the time came. And then there was the strangest and most secret battle of all, the War of the Codes. The armies and navies and air forces of the warring nations communicated by radio, in messages scrambled by ingenious machines into what seemed like meaningless gibberish, and each side believed its own codes unbreakable. But in a quiet country house in England, a remarkable group of mathematicians, scholars, and eccentric geniuses laboured in deepest secrecy to break the codes of the enemy, building some of the very first machines that pointed the way toward the computers of the future. They cracked the supposedly unbreakable German cipher, and from then on, the Allies could read a great part of the enemy's most secret communications, often before the intended recipients did. This was perhaps the most closely guarded secret of the entire war, so precious that the Allies sometimes let opportunities pass rather than risk, revealing that they were reading the enemy's mail. It helped them win the Battle of the Atlantic, hunt down the submarines, and anticipate the enemy's moves on land and sea. For decades after the war, the men and women who had done this work kept their silence, their triumph unknown, their names unsung, and only long afterward did the world learn how much it had owed to the quiet labours of those codebreakers in their secret rooms. These hidden struggles rarely make the grand sweep of the story. The maps with their bold arrows, the names of the famous battles. They were fought by people whose names are mostly forgotten now, in places that left no monuments. But they were real, and they mattered, and the men and women who fought them, in the cellars and the forests and the secret rooms, deserve to be remembered alongside the soldiers in the field. They remind us that even in the most total of wars, in the darkest of times, the human spirit found ways to resist, to outwit, and to fight for freedom, often at the cost of everything they had. For more than 2 years, the great powers of the West had been gathering their strength for the moment that would decide the war in Europe. The return to the continent, the invasion of occupied France, across the English Channel. It was the most complex and difficult operation of war ever attempted. The landing of a vast army on a hostile and heavily fortified shore. In the teeth of the enemy's defences, the Germans knew it was coming, and along the entire coast of France, they had built a formidable wall of bunkers and guns and obstacles, manned by their soldiers, sown with mines, ready to fling the invaders back into the sea. The Allies, for their part, assembled in the south of England an army and a fleet of staggering size, more than 1 million men, thousands of ships, vast stores of weapons and vehicles and supplies, until it was said the only thing keeping the island from sinking was the barrage balloons that floated above it, and they wove an elaborate web of deception to keep the enemy guessing where, exactly, the blow would fall. It fell at dawn on the 6th of June 1944, a day that would forever after be known simply by its code name, the Day of Days, along a stretch of the coast of the French region of Normandy. Normandy, in the grey light of early morning, the greatest invasion fleet in history appeared out of the mist. Through the night, paratroopers had dropped behind the enemy lines to seize bridges and crossroads. Now, as the naval guns thundered against the shore, thousands of landing crafts surged through the rough water toward the beaches, packed with seasick, frightened, determined young men. The doors dropped, and they waded ashore into a storm of fire. On some of the beaches, the landing went relatively smoothly. On others, above all on one stretch of sand that would become infamous, the defenders were strong and well placed, and the attackers were cut down in dreadful numbers, the water reddening, the sand strewn with the fallen. But they kept coming, wave after wave, and through sheer courage and sheer weight of numbers they fought their way up, off the beaches and into the German positions. And by the end of that long and bloody day, the Allies were ashore in France, and the wall had been breached. The fighting in the weeks that followed was hard and slow, for the country of Normandy, with its small fields bounded by thick ancient hedgerows, was perfect for defence, and the Germans contested every yard. But the Allies built up their forces faster than the Germans could, pouring men and tanks and supplies across the artificial harbours they had brought with them until they had gathered overwhelming strength. Then they broke out. The German line cracked, and the Allied armies, with the Americans driving hard on the flank, burst out of Normandy and raced across France. The German forces in the west, hammered from the air, harried by the resistance fighters who now rose openly against them, fell into headlong retreat. In August, after 4 years of occupation, the city of Paris was liberated, and its people poured into the streets in a delirium of joy, weeping and cheering as the first free troops, with the soldiers of de Gaulle's Free French in the lead, rolled into the capital. Across France and Belgium, town after town was freed, and the liberators were greeted with flowers and kisses and tears by people who had endured 4 long years in darkness. By the autumn of 1944, the Allied armies stood at the very borders of Germany itself, and many believed the war might be over by Christmas. But the German army, though battered and reeling, was not yet broken, and Hitler had one more blow to deliver. In December, in the depths of winter, he gathered his last reserves and launched a surprise offensive through the snowy forests of the Ardennes, the very region. The very through which he had struck so devastatingly in 1940. The attack caught the Allies off guard, smashing through their thin lines and driving a great bulge into their front, and for a few anxious weeks it seemed almost a return to the dark days of German triumph. American soldiers, surrounded and outnumbered in the frozen forests, fought on against desperate odds, and when one besieged town was called upon to surrender, its commander gave a one-word reply of defiance that became famous across the world. The Allies rallied, the skies cleared at last to let their aircraft strike, and the German offensive was halted and then thrown back. It had been Hitler's last gamble in the West, and it had failed, and in failing, it had used up the last of Germany's strength. After that, there was nothing left to stop the Allies from crossing the great river that guarded the western frontier and pouring into Germany itself. The end was now in sight. In the first months of 1945, the Great Vise closed upon Germany from both sides at once. From the west came the armies of Britain and America and their allies, crossing the Rhine and fanning out across the German heartland. From the east came the vast armies of the Soviet Union, hardened and vengeful after years of brutal war on their own soil, rolling across Poland and into Germany in an unstoppable flood. The German nation that had set out to conquer the world now found the war it had begun, returning at last to its own doorstep. Its cities lay in ruins from the bombing. Its armies were shattered. Its soldiers, now old men and young boys, flung into hopeless battle. Its people, who had cheered the conquests of the early years, now fled in terror before the advancing fronts, their homes destroyed, their future a ruin. The dream of a 1,000-year empire was collapsing into rubble and ash, and the man who had built it sat in a concrete bunker deep beneath his shattered capital. Moving armies that no longer existed across his maps, raging at the generals and the people he blamed for his defeat. The final agony of the war in Europe was the battle for Berlin. The Soviet armies, numbering in the millions, surged toward the German capital, determined to be the ones to capture the prize, to plant their flag over the lair of the enemy, who had brought such suffering to their land. The fighting was savage to the very end, the Germans defending the ruins of their capital street by street, as they had once defended Stalingrad. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Soviet armies fought their way into the heart of the burning city, closing in upon the very centre, where Hitler sheltered underground. There, with the enemy only streets away, with his empire in ruins and his armies destroyed, the dictator, who had unleashed the greatest catastrophe in human history, took his own life, rather than fall into the hands of those Sihons he had wronged so terribly. The man whose hatred had cost the world tens of millions of lives died in a bunker beneath the city he had promised to lead to glory. and a few days later, the last German forces in Berlin surrendered. With Hitler dead and Berlin fallen, the resistance of Germany swiftly crumbled. The new leaders who took his place had no choice but to seek an end to the slaughter, and they surrendered, completely and unconditionally, to the Allies. On the 8th of May 1945, the war in Europe came to an end. Across the continent, and in the cities of Britain and America and the Soviet Union, the news touched off scenes of wild, almost disbelieving joy. People poured into the streets to celebrate, strangers embracing, bells ringing, lights blazing in cities that had not shown a light at night for nearly 6 years. The long nightmare of the war in Europe was over. The dictators had been beaten. The conquered nations were free, and yet the joy was shadowed, deeply and forever, by the things that were now coming to light. For as the Allied armies had advanced across Germany and the conquered lands, they had come upon the camps. They had thrown open the gates and found within them sights that no human being should ever have to witness. The survivors, reduced to living skeletons, the dead in numbers beyond counting, the whole vast and methodical machinery of murder laid bare at last for all the world to see. Hardened soldiers who had seen every horror of the battlefield were broken by what they found there. The full and undeniable truth of what had been done, the murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, the depths to which a modern and civilized nation had descended, settled over the celebrations like a shroud. The world had won the war, but it had also been forced to look upon the worst that humanity is capable of, and it would never, ever be the same. In Europe, then, the guns fell silent at last, after almost 6 years of unimaginable destruction. But the war was not yet over. Far across the world, on the other side of the globe, the struggle still raged. For Japan had not surrendered, and the conflict in the Pacific was building toward its own terrible climax. The soldiers of the victorious Allies in Europe knew that many of them would soon be sent to that other war, to the bloody island fighting in the Pacific, where an enemy that would not surrender waited behind defences that grew more desperate and more fanatical the closer the Americans came to the home islands. The end of the war in Europe was a beginning as much as an end. The last and perhaps the most fateful act of the entire conflict was still to be played out in the islands and the skies of the Pacific, where the war would end in a manner that no one had foreseen, and that would cast a long and frightening shadow over all the years that followed. As the war in Europe ended, the Americans were drawing ever closer to the home islands of Japan, and the fighting grew more terrible with each step. The Japanese, defending the approaches to their homeland, fought with a desperation that shocked even the hardened American troops. On a small volcanic island called Iwo Jima, the Marines fought one of the bloodiest battles of the entire Pacific War to capture a few square miles of black sand and rock, the defenders fighting from a vast network of tunnels and caves until almost the last man was dead. On the larger island of Okinawa, the last great battle before the home islands, the fighting was even worse. A brutal struggle of weeks that cost the lives of vast numbers of soldiers, and, terribly, of the island civilians as well. And in the skies and on the seas around these islands, the Japanese unleashed a fearful new weapon, born of their desperation: the suicide pilots, who deliberately crashed their aircraft, loaded with explosives, into the American ships, young men flying willingly to their deaths in the belief that they could save their nation. These attacks sank and damaged many ships and killed thousands of sailors, and they sent a chilling message to the Americans about what an invasion of Japan itself might cost. For the Americans now faced a grim calculation. Japan had been defeated by any rational measure. Its navy was destroyed, its cities were being burned by relentless bombing, its people were beginning to starve, and there was no longer any hope of victory. And yet its leaders refused to surrender, and its soldiers fought on with a fanaticism that promised, in any invasion of the home islands, a bloodbath beyond imagining, with casualties that might run into the hundreds of thousands or even millions on both sides, soldiers and civilians alike. It was against this background that the American leaders made the most fateful decision of the entire war, and perhaps of the entire century. For in secret, through the years of war, American and British scientists had been labouring on a weapon of unprecedented and terrible power, a weapon that harnessed the very forces that bind together the heart of matter, a single bomb that could destroy an entire city in a flash of light. And now, at last, it was ready. In early August of 1945, an American aircraft flew over the Japanese city of Hiroshima and released a single bomb. In an instant, the city was destroyed. A blinding flash, a wave of unimaginable heat, a colossal blast. And a great part of the city simply ceased to exist. Tens of thousands of people killed in a single moment, tens of thousands more dying in the days and weeks that followed of their wounds and of a strange new sickness from the radiation the weapon released. 3 days later, when Japan still had not surrendered, a second such bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki with the same horrifying result. The world had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. Humanity had created a weapon capable of destroying not merely armies and cities, but in time civilization itself. The atomic age had begun in fire and shadow over the ruins of 2 Japanese cities. The shock of these blows, falling at the same moment that the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and swept into its territories in Asia, was finally enough. The Emperor of Japan, intervening as his government wavered, made the decision to surrender in a radio broadcast. His voice was heard by his people for the first time in their lives, telling them that they must endure the unendurable and bring the war to an end. On the 2nd of September 1945, aboard an American battleship in the Bay of Tokyo, the formal surrender of Japan was signed. The Second World War, the most destructive conflict in the history of the human race, was over at last. The silence that fell over the world in that moment was unlike any other. For 6 years the guns had thundered across the earth, and now, from the ruins of Europe to the islands of the Pacific, they were still. The cost of those 6 years was almost beyond comprehension. Estimates vary, but it is believed that some 60 million people, or even more, lost their lives, the great majority of them civilians. Ordinary people who had wanted nothing more than to live their lives in peace. Whole cities had been reduced to rubble. Whole nations had been shattered. The map of the world had been redrawn, and humanity had peered into an abyss of cruelty and destruction deeper than any it had known before, and had emerged, at last, exhausted and grieving, into an uncertain peace. Behind the great arrows on the maps, behind the names of the battles and the cold tally of the casualty figures, there were always the soldiers themselves, the millions of ordinary young men who actually fought the war. And it is worth pausing, before we come to the end, to remember what the war was for them. They came from every kind of place and every walk of life, farm boys and factory hands, clerks and students and fishermen, plucked from their ordinary lives and put into uniform and sent to the ends of the earth to fight, and perhaps to die for causes that the men at the very top understood far better than they did. Most of them were very young, many barely out of boyhood, and most of them had never wanted to be soldiers at all. They learned the trade of war the hard way. and they endured things that would mark them for the rest of their lives. For all the differences between the fronts, the soldiers' war had certain things in common everywhere. There was the endless waiting, the long stretches of boredom and discomfort that made up most of a soldier's life, the marching and the digging and the waiting for orders, broken by sudden moments of terror and chaos. There was the constant exhaustion, the sleeping in the open in the rain and the cold, the bad food, the dirt, the lice, the diseases. There was the strange and powerful bond that grew up between men who faced death together, a closeness deeper than almost any other in life, the comradeship that gave them the strength to go on when everything else failed, and the unbearable grief when one of their number was lost. And there was fear, the constant companion of every soldier, the fear that they learned to live with and to master, or that mastered them. The nature of the fighting varied enormously from place to place, and each front had its own particular hell. On the Eastern Front, there was the immensity and the savagery of it, the brutal cold of the winters, the seas of mud, the war without mercy, where surrender often meant death, and whole armies vanished into captivity, from which few returned. In the deserts of North Africa, there was the heat and the thirst, and the blinding sand, the strange clean openness of a war fought in an empty wilderness. In the jungles of the Pacific Islands, there was the heat, and the rot, and the disease, the close and terrifying combat against an enemy hidden in the green tangle who would not surrender and had to be killed almost to the last man. In the skies, there was the lonely terror of the airman, the long cold hours over enemy territory, the sudden violence of combat, the dreadful odds against surviving a full tour of operations. And on the seas, there was the particular dread of war on the water, the ever-present threat of the torpedo or the bomb, the knowledge that a sinking ship in the cold ocean offered little hope of rescue. What is most remarkable, perhaps, is how the ordinary soldiers endured it all. They were not, for the most part, heroes in the storybook sense, not men who relished war or sought glory. They were ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary and terrible circumstances, and who simply did what had to be done, day after day, out of duty, out of loyalty to the men beside them, out of a stubborn determination to survive and to see the thing through and to go home. They grumbled and they joked. They were frightened and they were brave, often both at once. They did terrible things and they did kind things. They were capable of great cruelty and of great compassion, sometimes within the same hour. They were, in short, human beings, neither angels nor monsters, caught up in something far larger and darker than themselves, and trying, as best they could, to remain themselves within it. When the war ended, those who survived came home. But they did not come home unchanged. They had seen things that could not be unseen, done things that could not be undone, lost friends who could never be replaced. Many of them never spoke of it, locking their memories away, carrying them in silence for the rest of their lives. They went back to their ordinary lives, to their families and their jobs, and they built the peaceful world of the years that followed. But the war was always there, inside them, surfacing in the quiet moments, in the dreams that came at night, in the sudden grip of a memory triggered by a sound or a smell. They were the generation that had borne the weight of the greatest catastrophe in history. And they bore it, for the most part, with a quiet dignity that asked for little in return. As the years passed, their numbers thinned, and one by one they slipped away, until at last the war passed out of living memory altogether into the keeping of history. But while they lived, they were the living link to all of it, the men and women who could say, simply, that they had been there. The peace that followed the war was a strange and somber thing, for the world that emerged from the conflict was utterly transformed. The old order, in which a handful of European powers had dominated the globe, was gone forever. Britain and France, though they stood among the victors, were exhausted and impoverished, their treasuries empty, their empires beginning to crumble as the colonized peoples of Asia and Africa, who had seen their masters humbled and had often fought in the war themselves, began to demand their own freedom. In the years and decades that followed, the great empires would dissolve and dozens of new nations would be born across the world. Germany lay in ruins, defeated and occupied, divided among the victorious powers. Japan too was occupied and rebuilt, and in their place, two new powers towered above all others, two giants that had emerged from the war stronger than any others, and that now faced each other across a divided world. They were the United States and the Soviet Union. These two had fought as allies against a common enemy. But they were divided by everything else, by their systems of government, their beliefs about how human beings should live, their visions of the future. As the war ended, the wartime friendships swiftly curdled into suspicion and hostility. The Soviet Union, having liberated the nations of Eastern Europe from the Germans, did not free them, but instead imposed upon them. Governments loyal to itself, drawing across the continent what came to be called an Iron Curtain, dividing a free West from a communist East. The world, having just emerged from one great struggle, found itself sliding into another, not a war of armies and battles, but a long and frozen confrontation between two armed camps, a contest that came to be known as the Cold War, and that would shape the lives of everyone on Earth for nearly half a century. And hanging over all of it, casting its shadow over every quarrel and every crisis, was the terrible new weapon that had ended the war, the atomic bomb, which both sides now raced to build in ever greater numbers, until they held in their hands the power to destroy not just each other, but all of human civilization. Yet, the war did not leave behind only division and fear. Out of the wreckage, out of the determination that such a catastrophe must never be allowed to happen again, the nations of the world came together to build something new. They founded a great organization, the United Nations, a parliament of all the peoples of the earth, dedicated to keeping the peace and resolving the quarrels of nations through words rather than weapons. It was, in a sense, a second attempt at the dream that had failed after the First Great War. But this time it was built on firmer ground, with the great powers themselves at its heart. And in the aftermath of the horrors that had been revealed, the world took another step that had never been taken before. The leaders of the defeated regime, who had planned and carried out the great crimes of the war, were brought before a court of the nations and put on trial, not by the law of any single country, but in the name of humanity itself, for crimes against humanity. It was established for the first time that there were some acts so terrible that no soldier and no leader could escape responsibility for them by claiming he was only following orders, and that the conscience of mankind itself could sit in judgment. The lessons of those 6 years would echo down through all the generations that followed. The world had learned, at a cost almost too dreadful to bear, where certain things lead. It had learned that aggression, unopposed only, grows bolder, that the appeasement of tyrants buys not peace, but a worse war later on. It had learned that the machinery of a modern state turned to evil ends can carry out horrors on a scale that earlier ages could scarcely have imagined. And it had learned, in the camps and the killing pits, where the hatred of one's fellow human beings can lead when it is given the power of a state and the tools of an industrial age. These were hard lessons, bought with the lives of tens of millions, and the world resolved, in the bright and terrible aftermath, never to forget them. Whether it has truly kept that resolve is a question that each generation must answer anew. For the survivors, the ones who had lived through it all, the end of the war was not a clean ending, but the beginning of a long reckoning. There were the soldiers who came home changed, carrying memories they could never fully share. There were the cities to rebuild, the dead to mourn, the millions of refugees and displaced persons, wandering a ruined continent in search of homes that no longer existed, families to be reunited or grieved. There were the small everyday acts of recovery, the planting of gardens in bombed-out lots, the reopening of schools, the slow return of ordinary life, out of the greatest destruction the world had ever known. People set about, quietly and stubbornly, the work of living again. The generation that had fought and endured the war would carry its mark all their lives. And they would build, out of their suffering and their hope, much of the world that we know today, the institutions and the alliances, and the long peace among the great powers that for all its tensions has held now for longer than any of them dared to hope. And so the story comes to its close, here at the edge of a new and uncertain age, began in the quiet, wounded years after one great war, in the resentment of a defeated nation and the dreams of dangerous men, and it grew, step by unchecked step, into the largest and most terrible conflict the world has ever known. It swept across nearly every land and sea. It reached into the lives of almost everyone then alive, and it left behind it a changed and chastened world. Tens of millions did not live to see its ending. The ones who did carried it with them all their days. The names of the battles, the cities, the leaders, the lost, have passed now into history, written in books and carved in stone, remembered each year by those who come after. There is no neat lesson to wrap around so vast a thing, no simple meaning that can hold all that suffering and all that courage. There is only the long road of it, the slow turning of the years, the way one event led to the next, until the whole world was aflame, and the way, in the end, it burned itself out, and the silence returned. We remember it not to relive its horrors, but so that the dead are not forgotten, and so that the hard-won lessons are not lost. But now, the years grow quiet. The guns are long silent. The smoke has cleared from the skies, and the grass has grown again over the old battlefields, green and soft and forgiving. Let the names settle gently into the dark. Let the great struggle pass into memory, like a storm that has finally blown itself out, leaving the world washed and still. The night is calm now. The long story is told. Rest easy, wherever you are. Let it all drift away, soft as falling snow. Sleep well, and good night.